Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to 20th Century Revolutions. Episode 2.4, The Kresna Razlog Uprising, Bulgarian Unification, Part 1. Last time, we checked in on things down in Egypt, as we followed the dramatic events of the Urabi Revolt, which ironically began as an anti-foreigner uprising and ended with the British stumbling into an occupation of Ottoman Egypt. And this somewhat accidental British occupation would go on to last for 3/4 of a century. And in the big picture, this so-called veiled protectorate, in which the British gradually established a semi-secret and somewhat informal imperial rule over Egypt while the country remained under nominal Ottoman suzerainty, is indicative of what would go on in nearly all of the peripheral areas of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century. Whether it was the Austrian army occupying Ottoman Bosnia-Herzegovina, or French bankers taking over the finances of Ottoman Tunisia, or the Russian Pan-Slavs driving policy in Ottoman Bulgaria, the peripheral territories of the Ottoman Empire in the wake of the Congress of Berlin in many ways came to be most defined by great power meddling. And today, this foreign interference is going to take on a new and potentially even more dangerous form for the Ottomans, as the leaders of the newly autonomous Principality of Bulgaria begin to challenge the territorial arrangement agreed to at the Congress of Berlin. This move by the Bulgarians will be a direct assault on the sovereign authority of the Ottoman Empire. But for reasons that we will discuss, the Ottomans won't be able to do a thing about it. And so, not only were the great powers squeezing all of the territory they possibly could out of the Ottomans, but now the Bulgarians, who were supposedly still Ottoman vassals, would also seek to pry Ottoman domains away from their alleged master. So over the next 2 episodes, we will be discussing the events that will culminate with the unification of the Principality of Bulgaria with the Ottoman province of Eastern Rumelia, which will basically solidify the outlines of the modern Bulgarian nation-state. And at first, I tried to squeeze all of Bulgarian unification into one episode, but it kind of got out of control. So instead of one gigantic episode, I decided to split this up into 2 slightly shorter episodes. And then, just so you have some idea of what I'm up to over here in tying all of this into the broader story of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, by covering Bulgarian unification in some detail, we're not only going to tie up some loose ends and have a little fun following up on some storylines coming out of our mini-series on Bulgarian liberation, but also Bulgarian unification was an integral part of the broader transformation of the Ottoman Empire happening in the wake of the Congress of Berlin, which we began to look at last week with Britain's establishment of their imperial rule over the veiled protectorate of Ottoman Egypt. And this transformation was essentially just the rapid shrinking of the Ottoman Empire in the early years of Sultan Abdul Hamid's reign. And as the borders of the Ottoman Empire just kept creeping ever further inwards, there would grow this paranoid feeling of being hemmed in on all sides as the great powers hungrily ate away at more and more of the Ottoman lands. And this process would create somewhat of a siege mentality that would have subtle and yet very profound effects on the thinking of Ottoman leaders, with Sultan Abdul Hamid really being the ultimate embodiment of this kind of paranoia. So in this context, the unification of Bulgaria represented somewhat of a turning point, because the annexation of Eastern Rumelia did not come about as the result of great power demands, but rather as the result of bold rebelliousness on the part of the Bulgarians. And since the Bulgarians used to be Ottoman subjects, and in fact many Bulgarians still were Ottoman subjects in places like Macedonia, this annexation set a dangerous precedent because it solidified the impression amongst the Ottoman leadership that their Christian subjects were directly responsible for Ottoman territorial losses. This evolution in the mindset of Ottoman leaders would ultimately lead to catastrophic consequences for Ottoman Christians still living in the empire, whether they be Bulgarians in Macedonia, or Greeks in Constantinople, or Armenians and Assyrians in eastern Anatolia. And in the long term, this paranoid fear of the empire's dismemberment at the hands of both the European great powers and their own Christian subjects will hang like a nightmare on the brains of the Young Turks as they entrench their own power from 1908 to 1913. Because nearly all of the future leaders of the Young Turks will emerge from the vanishing world of Ottoman Europe, and their early lives would be stamped by the experience of watching their ancestral homelands being annexed by the European great powers or by the emergent nation-states of the Balkans. And arguably the most powerful Young Turk leader, Mehmed Talat, who would solidify his dictatorial rule in 1913 as one of the three pashas, would in his youth be stamped specifically by Bulgarian liberation. Because Mehmed Talat was a Bulgarian Muslim of mixed ethnic heritage, and like so many Muslims living in Bulgaria during this time, the Russo-Turkish War was definitely not experienced as a liberation struggle, but instead as a foreign occupation by a murderous Russian army. And as a very young boy, Talat's family would be forced to join the masses of Muslim refugees escaping the onslaught of this Russian army as he and his family fled to Constantinople. So, as we tell the story of Bulgarian unification, that is the ultimate context that we must keep in the back of our minds. That while Balkan liberation for Ottoman Christians was experienced as the joyous formation of newly independent nation-states, for Ottoman Muslims living in Europe, Balkan liberation was experienced as a traumatic refugee crisis. But okay, with all that said, let's head on back to Bulgaria and get ourselves caught up. As we know all too well, the Great Eastern Crisis and the subsequent Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78 affected Ottoman Bulgaria probably more than any other region. Because, to start with, this crisis and subsequent war came about as a result of the Bulgarian April Uprising and the violent Ottoman reprisals taken against the Bulgarians in response to this uprising. And then the Russian invasion that followed this uprising was more than anything else a war of liberation for Orthodox Bulgarians. Because as the Russians marched towards Constantinople, they were just liberating town after town throughout Ottoman Bulgaria, usually being welcomed by jubilant crowds of Orthodox Bulgarians who saw the Russians as conquering heroes. But then, in the aftermath of this war of liberation, the euphoria of victory quickly turned into bitterness, as the original settlement at San Stefano was retracted by the always scheming great powers. And while Bulgaria almost became an independent Slavic superstate stretching across the entire southern Balkans from the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, instead, the Bulgarians were left in control of the autonomous Principality of Bulgaria, essentially a rump state wedged between the Danube River and the Balkan Mountains. And many, many Bulgarians would never forget what they had been promised at the Treaty of San Stefano. And Bulgarian revolutionaries who had survived the events of the April Uprising or had fought in the War of Liberation would come to see their work as only halfway done. And now that autonomy had been achieved, the goals of these revolutionaries would pivot from the liberation of Bulgaria proper to the liberation of their Bulgarian brothers and sisters still living under Ottoman rule in Macedonia or in Thrace. So the aim of these revolutionaries would now be to expand the borders of their newly autonomous principality so as to recreate San Stefano, Bulgaria. So let's remind ourselves of what had been included in the Big Bulgaria of San Stefano. And while we are going through this, it's not a bad idea to pull up some of the maps at 20thCenturyRevolutions.com, because a lot of this is a wee bit confusing. But to start, San Stefano, Bulgaria, of course, included the territory of what was now the autonomous Principality of Bulgaria. And like I said, this was a small strip of land sitting in between the Danube River and the Balkan Mountains. And its main cities were Sofia, the future capital, and Pleven, site of the dramatic siege during the Russo-Turkish War. Then, at the Congress of Berlin, the great powers had agreed on a compromise in which they established a province called Eastern Rumelia that was to be autonomous, much like the Principality of Bulgaria, but it was to have a completely separate government. And this province lay directly to the south of the Principality of Bulgaria, sitting just on the other side of the Balkan mountain range, and encompassing much of the territory that the Ottomans typically called Northern Thrace. Now, originally, these two provinces were going to be called something like Northern Bulgaria and Southern Bulgaria. But this offended the sensitive British, who were afraid that the Russians would simply assert their control over both of these Bulgarian provinces. So they thought that maybe if they just left the word Bulgaria out of the name, then everyone might just forget that these two provinces had ever been joined together. I mean, that's a good idea, right? Well, as we will see, this separation only drove the leaders of both of these provinces to do everything in their power to make a future union as smooth as possible, as the founders wrote nearly identical constitutions, crafted systems of government that directly mirrored each other, and established open commerce across each other's borders. These steps would hopefully make future unification as simple as issuing a single decree or electing a shared prince. Because basically none of the people living in these two regions were happy about the fact that they had been divided. And then that leaves us with the third region of San Stefano, Bulgaria, Macedonia. And boy, Macedonia is a pretty tough nut to crack. But don't worry, we will have plenty of time to talk all about Macedonia, because it is the birthplace of the Constitutional Revolution of 1908. And it is no accident that the young Turks will launch their assault on Sultan Abdul Hamid from this incredibly tumultuous region of the Balkans. Because in the wake of the Congress of Berlin, Macedonia would become a hotbed of revolution and conspiracy, just absolutely teeming with secret organizations and guerrilla bands and terrorist groups and all that good stuff. And the reason that Macedonia will become a center of revolutionary activity in the Ottoman Empire is, in short, because basically all of these surrounding countries thought that Macedonia belonged to them. As we have mentioned, multiple nations felt that they had an historic right to claim Macedonia as their own. So, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and the Ottomans will all lay claim to Macedonia, each for their own reasons. And then, of course, all of these countries felt that their own claims were the most legitimate. And in the coming years, Macedonia will become littered with clandestine revolutionary organizations representing the interests of each of these countries, both informally and formally. And these groups will essentially engage in low-grade warfare for decades to come, as they all had the mutually exclusive goal of annexing Macedonia into their mother country. And everyone was willing to resort to violence to achieve this goal. This violent tension that would come to define Macedonia in the years to come was immediately evident even before the ink was dry on the 1878 Treaty of Berlin. Because when news of the dismemberment of San Stefano, Bulgaria, reached Bulgarian revolutionaries who had just seen their friends and comrades die for the cause of liberation, they were flabbergasted. And this group of revolutionaries included two of our old friends, Stefan Stambolov and Lubin Karavelov, who had been some of the very few members of the Bulgarian Revolutionary Central Committee who had managed to survive the events of the April Uprising and the Russo-Turkish War. Now, Karavelov had survived because, you may remember, he had actually been boxed out of the BRCC and forced to resign as their chairman when the younger cohort under Hristobotev and Stefan Stambolov took over. So Karavelov had actually not taken part in the events of the April Uprising. But he was more of an academic type anyways. Stefan Stambolov, for his part, had been integral to the planning of the April Uprising, and he had led one of the BRCC's revolutionary districts before they got swept away by the Bashi Bazouks. But Stefan Stambolov had been lucky enough to escape the wrath of the Ottomans, and he managed to flee to Romania. So Stambolov, Karavelov, and other revolutionary survivors had eagerly returned to Bulgaria and eastern Rumelia after the Russians had liberated those territories. And these Bulgarian leaders hoped to take an active part in charting the course of their new nation. However, like most other Orthodox Bulgarians, Stambolov and Karavelov were outraged when they received the news that Bulgaria had been split up into 3 separate provinces. And in response, they would form a committee called Unity, whose purpose you can probably gather from their name. And seeing as this committee had just been founded by former members of the Bulgarian Revolutionary Central Committee, it should be no surprise that this Unity Committee would just go straight back to their old revolutionary tactics in their efforts to reclaim San Stefano, Bulgaria. Because hadn't these tactics just miraculously earned them liberation? So, the Unity Committee began to recruit local Hajduk bandits, to gather weapons, and to establish local revolutionary committees throughout Bulgaria, Eastern Rumelia, and Macedonia, all with the purpose of launching a future uprising. And the first revolutionary action would take place in Eastern Macedonia, in a region that lay just across the border from Bulgaria. When the Unity Committee sent a group of their agents into Macedonia, they found that many local Slavs were in fact already planning an uprising under the leadership of a Bulgarian bishop and revolutionary writer named Nathaniel of Ohrid. Now, you may remember that Bulgarian church officials had actually been some of the earliest leaders to promote proto-Bulgarian nationalism in their push for an autonomous Bulgarian church. Well, Nathaniel had been one such leader, and he had played an active part in the Bulgarian national revival, alongside people like Georgi Rakovsky and Lyuben Karavelov, as he translated many religious works into Bulgarian and wrote a few of his own treatises that would go on to be influential in helping to forge the early Bulgarian Orthodox national identity. And then we didn't talk about this quite as much as we probably should have, but while the BRCC had been busy planning uprisings and launching Chetty attacks, church leaders such as Nathaniel had continued in their struggle to achieve autonomy for the Bulgarian church. Because you may remember that Orthodox Bulgarians had always worshipped under the leadership of the Patriarchate of the Greek Orthodox Church. And with the rise of Greek nationalism, Bulgarian church leaders began to chafe under the Greek-dominated leadership of the Patriarchate. But after decades of pressing for church autonomy and promoting Bulgarian history and culture amongst their parishioners, these church leaders finally convinced the Sultan to recognize their autonomy in 1870. And so was born what would come to be called the Bulgarian Exarchate. Now, I don't want to get in the weeds of church politics, but the Exarchate was technically not independent. However, they did secure the Sultan's blessing for becoming an autonomous unit, and, well, the Greek Patriarchate rejected this decision. So, for all intents and purposes, the Bulgarian Exarchate seceded from the Greek Patriarchate in 1870. So, the Bulgarian Church and the Greek Church are now pretty much separate Orthodox entities. And critically, the Sultan agreed that the Bulgarian Exarchate would be able to administer regions in which 2/3 of its inhabitants voted to secede from the Greek Patriarchate. And since Bulgarian leaders like Nathaniel had been whipping up support for the Bulgarian Church for decades now, the arrival of the Exarchate was pretty popular amongst the Slavs. So, in practice, this 2/3 voting policy led the Bulgarian Exarchate to encompass the entirety of San Stefano, Bulgaria, including Thrace and Macedonia. And this, in fact, was a huge reason why the Big Bulgaria of San Stefano had included those areas in the first place, because those writing the treaty essentially just used the Bulgarian Exarchate as their model. And then after the great powers at the Congress of Berlin retracted San Stefano, the territory of the Bulgarian Exarchate became just one more thing that the Bulgarians could point to as proof that they deserved to control Macedonia and Eastern Rumelia. So you can probably imagine why Bishop Nathaniel would be a wee bit upset when he learned that the territory of the Bulgarian Exarchate had been splintered into 3 different autonomous units. And to make matters worse, the unit that old Nathaniel now found himself in was Macedonia, which was still a part of the Ottoman Empire. So this radical priest started reaching out to some of the old voivode leaders of the Chetty warbands to see if they might be interested in taking things into their own hands. And then as the agents from the Bulgarian Unity Committee got wind of these preparations, they made contact with Nathaniel to see how they might be able to help. So, members of these different groups, under the leadership of Nathaniel of Ohrid, gathered at the ancient and remote Rila Monastery, where they made plans to launch an uprising in eastern Macedonia. And specifically, the area they were targeting was right across the Bulgarian border, and their goal was to annex this territory into the Principality of Bulgaria. So, in October of 1878, just 4 months after the Great Powers had signed the Treaty of Berlin, around 400 rebels descended on the town of Kresna and launched coordinated attacks against several different local inns where a contingent of Ottoman soldiers were currently staying. And somewhat ironically, these soldiers had actually been sent into the area to maintain order. And well, that plan didn't work, and these Ottoman soldiers were caught completely off guard and defeated by the Bulgarian rebels, who were quickly able to garner support from many locals who joined up with the revolt. And then these rebels began to fan out into the surrounding area until they had liberated nearly 50 of the surrounding towns and villages, including the town of Razlog, which is why this uprising is called the Kresna Razlog Uprising. So, at the height of the uprising, the rebels controlled a pretty long strip of territory within eastern Macedonia, running alongside nearly the entire border of Bulgaria. And once they had control of this area, rebel leaders began to formulate a plan for the creation of a central committee that would be charged with extending the uprising further into the heart of Macedonia. However, before these plans could be hatched, the Ottoman military quickly descended into the area, and these troops were accompanied by bands of Bashi-Bazuk. And in an episode eerily reminiscent of the atrocities that followed the April Uprising, these Bashi-Bazuk would ruthlessly crush this rebellion. And even though scattered and isolated rebel bands would hold out for over 6 months, within a few weeks the uprising was for all intents and purposes a dead letter. Now, a big reason why the uprising ultimately failed was that Russia was in no position to launch another costly campaign to liberate the Slavs of Macedonia. So the atrocities of the Bashi-Bazuk following the Kresna-Razlog uprising went largely unnoticed by the great powers, who at this point kind of just wanted things to settle down and wished that these people would just accept the Treaty of Berlin and move on already. I mean, the great powers have spoken. It's a done deal. So these rebels learned the hard lesson that they would never be able to achieve their goals unless they had the backing of a great power like Russia. And really, the most immediate result of the Kresna-Razlog uprising was that around 30,000 Bulgarians would flee Macedonia and migrate to the Principality of Bulgaria in order to escape the horrific atrocities committed by the Bashi-Bazuk, who would now unleash a fairly prolonged campaign of terror against the Christians of Macedonia. Now, the legacy of the Kresna-Razlog uprising is super interesting, because the event is seen as a formative national moment to this day in both Bulgaria and North Macedonia. But the nationalist historians from these two countries each tell a very different story. For Bulgarian nationalists, the uprising was a direct outgrowth of the larger struggle for Bulgarian liberation. I mean, members of the BRCC were directly involved in the planning of the uprising, and then many people who took part in the revolt would return to Bulgaria and help form the early government of the new principality. But for nationalists of northern Macedonia, the event was a moment of national awakening in which the rebels proclaimed their Macedonian identity, and this identity was completely separate from Bulgaria. Now, the reason that these two stories can both be told is because in the proclamations made by the leaders of the Kresna-Razlog revolt, the revolutionaries made lots of statements that seem kind of contradictory, at least to us as modern observers. Because the revolutionaries called for all Macedonians to join their struggle to liberate Macedonia, no matter their religion or nationality. But they also very clearly identified their struggle as one meant to liberate the Slavic people of Macedonia, who spoke a dialect of Bulgarian. And, like we said, they were also in direct talks with elements of the newly formed Principality of Bulgaria about possibly joining their new nation. So, how could this uprising pursue both the liberation of Macedonia for the Macedonians, while also seeking to annex Macedonia into Bulgaria? I mean, isn't this contradictory? Well, first and foremost, during this time, a lot of people just didn't see any issue in being both Macedonian and Bulgarian. I mean, the same would go for Greek-speaking people in Macedonia, who would also see no issue in calling themselves both Greek and Macedonian. And plus, this was a revolutionary coalition for Pete's sake. And as we should all know quite well, revolutionary coalitions are almost as a rule diverse and contradictory. In their proclamations, the rebels were likely trying to appeal to as many different people as they could. So what this meant in practice is that a lot of people with competing interests took part in the Kresna Razlog uprising. Because as we've talked about, nearly all Bulgarian leaders wanted to annex Macedonia in order to recreate San Stefano, Bulgaria. So people like Stefan Stambolov and Lyuben Karavelov had the annexation of Macedonia as their ultimate goal. And if these Bulgarian leaders could point to the large Slavic population of Macedonia and say, hey look, all those people are basically speaking Bulgarian. I mean, sure, it's a dialect, but it's basically Bulgarian, and a ton of them worship under the Bulgarian Exarchate. Obviously, we should be able to annex this territory full of Bulgarians into Bulgaria. And while there is some truth to such claims, it wasn't so simple for the Slavs who called Macedonia home. Because for most Macedonian Slavs, i.e. Macedonian peasants, they really just wanted an end to the violent chaos that had been set off by the Great Eastern Crisis. Because in the aftermath of the April Uprising, the Russo-Turkish War, and now the Kresna Razlog Uprising, the day-to-day existence of Slavic peasants came to be most defined by an ever-present fear of falling victim to the retribution of the Bashi-Bazouks, who were now roaming and pillaging without restraint. So, if a Bulgarian guerrilla leader approached a community made up of said Slavic peasants and offered them protection in exchange for their loyalty to the Bulgarian church and/or the Bulgarian nation, they might be pretty likely to accept this offer because it was often a matter of life or death. But they also might accept the protection of a guerrilla leader professing loyalty to a Macedonian identity separate from the Bulgarian nation or the Bulgarian church. Or, for that matter, they might accept the protection of a Greek guerrilla leader. That is all to say that we must keep in mind that just because a group of people speak the same language as a neighboring country does not mean that those people necessarily want to be part of that neighboring country. And perhaps even more importantly, we can't assume that there is any consensus whatsoever amongst a given population on what people want or don't want. Some people wanted annexation into Bulgaria. Some people wanted an autonomous Macedonia. Yeah, it's complicated, and it's really only going to get even more complicated. And all of these contradictions and competing agendas will become a defining feature of the revolutionary struggle in Macedonia. And as weird as it might sound, it will oftentimes be nearly impossible to tell if a given community is Bulgarian or Serbian or Greek or Macedonian. And this fact is precisely why the region would become the center of revolutionary intrigue and nationalist expansionism, because Macedonia was a very diverse place, full of Bulgarians, Serbs, Greeks, Turks, Albanians, Circassians, Jews, and so on. And for many Macedonians, i.e. people living in Macedonia, whether Christian or Muslim, their national and ethnic loyalty was sometimes pretty ambivalent, and everyday people were not that firmly attached to a certain ethnic label. Like the people of a given village might decide to all one day become Bulgarians if representatives of Bulgaria offered them a good enough deal. So, in the coming years, guerrilla war bands and church officials and secret government agents from Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece will all descend on the territory with the aim of bringing people over to their side, as national loyalties could often change overnight. And this conflict to win the hearts and minds of the people of Macedonia will become known as the Macedonian Struggle. And the Kresna Razlog Uprising was simply the first act within this great drama, a drama that will continue for decades to come. Now, we are going to put a pin in Macedonia for now. But don't worry, we will continue to discuss this fascinating vortex of ethno-religious conflict in much more detail, because, like we said, it's the birthplace of the Young Turk Revolution. And as we will see, the junior officers of the Third Army of Macedonia, people like Ismail Enver and Ahmed Niazi, would cut their teeth fighting Christian guerrilla bands in Macedonia before they launched their revolution against the Sultan. And these experiences fighting in the Macedonian struggle would stamp the politics and methods of the Young Turks, as people like Enver and Niazi would come to have a grim respect for their Orthodox opponents. And the most prominent of these guerrilla bands, the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, or the MRO, who, by the way, had as their revolutionary motto, Macedonia for the Macedonians, will actually end up lending their support to the Young Turks in their early effort to restore constitutional government to the Ottoman Empire. But for real, Matt, let's put a pin in Macedonia because we are coming back to all of this later. And as we'll see, the Bulgarians will themselves put a pin in Macedonia. Because now that Bulgarian revolutionaries dreaming of San Stefano, Bulgaria, had tried but failed to annex Macedonia, in the years after the Kresna Razlog uprising, these revolutionaries will instead turn their attention towards the other and slightly easier piece of the big Bulgaria puzzle, Eastern Rumelia. So, join me next week as the Bulgarians take another bold step towards independence, as they ignore all of the warnings of the great powers and declare Bulgarian unification.